Welcome and thank you for joining me as we take another look at a psalm. We've reached Psalm 61 in our journey through this Psalter, and it is one of that group of psalms that I think begins at 52 and goes on to at least 62, which are all come out of periods of time in David's life when he was suffering persecution, enmity from those who wanted to destroy his life, often on the run, and feeling often in very great danger. Sometimes in these psalms, as we've seen them, there are very specific historical events that give birth to the psalm. Other times more general principles of what it's like to be under attack and in danger and having to call out to God. And what we have here in 61, again, is a more general psalm. There's no specific historical event mentioned, but we can glean some information from the text of the psalm itself. Let me point out a couple of things to you from the content. First of all, we know from verses 6 to 7, and we'll come back to this in just a moment, that David is at this point in time king. This is not when he's waiting to be made king, when Saul is after his life. This is when he is already king. And then we see also from verse 2, as David prays from, as he calls it, the end of the earth, that David is, although king, not in Jerusalem at this particular point in time. He is, at least emotionally and mentally, as far away from Jerusalem as he could possibly be, and therefore he feels as far away from God in one sense as he possibly could do. And so he prays here for God's help, but also prays with great assurance. Let me show you how I would divide up this psalm. Verses 1 to 5 really go together in a sense, but there are two sections within 1 to 5 which are both pairs. So in verse 1 and in verse 4 you have a prayer, and then those two prayers are backed up, if you like, by the motivation for praying or the reasoning behind his prayers. So verse 2 begins with the word for, and verse 5 begins with the word for. So he's praying something and then giving the reason for his praying. And we've seen these many times through the Psalms, so we're not going to dwell on them in this particular study. But notice his prayer is based on who God is, his rock, his refuge, his deliverer, etc., and what God has done for him in the past. He calls back on previous experiences of God coming to his aid in answer to his prayer. So you have verses 1 to 5, and in verse 8 you have a confident assertion by David that there's a day coming when his prayer has been answered, no doubt back in Jerusalem, and he will offer the right praises to God, and he will give thanks to God duly for his deliverance of him. But then in the middle you get verses 6 and 7, which are really quite remarkable and striking verses within this particular psalm. Remember that David is the author of the psalm. We know that from the introductory words, and we know that David is king at this moment in time. And yet David prays for the prolonged reign and eternal reign of the king. How do we make sense of that? Well, you see, verse 6a on its own could just be David praying for longer life, prolong the life of the king. But it can't be as simple as that, because it goes on to pray that the king's years would endure to all generations and that he might be enthroned forever before God. Now that obviously is not going to apply to David himself, and he has no thought of that in his own mind. But there is a sense in which it is true of David. It is a sense in which David is praying, not so much for himself personally, but for his descendants. Because I think David here is praying based on a very specific, glorious promise made to him, recorded in 2 Samuel 7, that said there would be an eternal continuance of the throne of David. You will never fail to have a descendant sitting on the throne, was the promise made to him by God. And of course that promise was fulfilled, and is still today being fulfilled, in the person and reign of the Lord Jesus Christ. So this is, in one sense, in a limited sense, a messianic psalm. David is praying for the eternal reign of his, at least his future descendant, who is of course the Lord Jesus Christ. It's a lovely picture of David's confidence that God will keep all his promises to him. Now, what do we make of this psalm for our own spiritual benefit and well-being? Well, I'm sure there are times in your life, maybe you're there at this moment in time, when you feel far from God. For whatever reason, you feel as far from God as you possibly could feel. Well, here's the reassurance for you, that God, as he was to David, is your refuge. He's your rock. He's your deliverer. He's the one that you can run to. And God in Jesus Christ is still God's promise for you. And all you need to do, without even physically traveling an inch, is to cry out to God, run to God, and take refuge in God. And because Jesus is today enthroned before God forever, you have all the certainty of the Godhead itself, himself, that God will hear your prayer and come to your aid and be to you all that you have need of. May the Lord bless you.